Okay. Also, if you happen to have a registration time during this class, which it always tends to happen, then I'm okay if you grab your computer and just sit out on a bench for a second and do that and then come back in. I just don't want you doing that in class and distracting everybody. But if you want to step out for a sec, that's fine. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're gonna dive into a little bit more about muscle today. So learning about kind of the microanatomy of muscle, what the cells look like, and what the tissue looks like. Okay, so let's start out here. Longest cells in the body. What do you think? What's that? Okay. Yeah, it'll be okay. Yeah. All right, so go ahead and send in your guess there. If you're not sure, just send something in. All right, anybody else? Give you about 5 seconds. All right. Okay, so we got about 40% of you saying A, about 50% saying B. So we're kind of split there between nerve cells or neurons, skeletal muscle cells or myocytes. Okay, so axons of certain nerves can be up to 6 to 12 feet long, depending on how tall the person is, depending on how much kind of wrapping around things are going on. But then muscle cells can be quite long too, can be 2 to 3 feet long. And that's just a single cell, right? That's the microscopic thing we've been talking about of a cell. So very, very thin, but incredibly long, right? And so when you think of that muscle, the sartorius that you guys learned, right? Longest muscle in the body, that is a muscle which is called a parallel fiber type of muscle. Okay, and you learned about those fascicle arrangements, right, on last Friday's class, I think. And so parallel muscle fibers mean that some of the fibers run the whole length of the muscle, right? Some of the cells run the whole length of the muscle. So you have a cell that goes from here to here, right? And that's a single cell, right? About 20% of the cells in the sartorius run the whole length of the muscle. So that's a long ways, right? That's a few feet long, single cell, right? And so that's that. But nerve cells are a little bit longer for sure. Okay. All right. So let's talk about general characteristics of muscle. And we're not just talking about skeletal muscle, we're talking about cardiac muscle and smooth muscle as well. Okay. So all muscle tissue is excitable, which means we can stimulate it and then control it. Okay. It's all contractile, which means we can forcefully shorten it. Okay. That allows us to move things, to carry things, to do work with this tissue. Really, the definition of work is just to kind of like move something over a certain distance, right? And so we can do work with muscle. Okay, it's also extensible, which means we can stretch it out. Okay, which allows for so a little bit of extra range of motion, right? So we can like stretch out a joint a certain extent actively. Right. So if you just take the example of like your finger, that's as far back as I can get my finger in extension, but then I can push it further, right? That's the passive part. Like actively I can get it there, passively I can push it a little bit further, right? That's your muscle tissue as well as some of your connective tissue stretching out, extending. Okay, that's its extensibility. And then the fourth one is it's also elastic. Okay, so we stretch it out, but then it has a force inside of it that causes it to bounce back to its original shape after it's been stretched too. Okay, so it's excitable, we can control it. It's contractile, it can shorten forcefully. It's extensible, meaning we can stretch it out. And it's elastic, meaning that it bounces back to its original shape after we stretch it out. Okay, and that we actually utilize that extensibility or the elasticity quite often to give us kind of free energy, right? So when we take a, For example, when we take a step, the energy needed in our calf muscles to propel our body, like our triceps array, you're going to learn those muscles soon, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. Probably already learned them in the cat, right? Dissected those. We get about 20 to 30% of the energy of propelling our body just by the elasticity of muscle. In that, it's like free energy, right? That doesn't require us to use ATP, that adenosine triphosphate chemical we talked about before. And so that means it doesn't require us to break down any glucose or fat or protein to make that. It's just free energy because our muscle's elastic. It kind of pushes us forward a little bit, right? So that's one of the kind of benefits of having this elasticity. Okay, questions so far on these 4 characteristics? Okay, so this applies to all muscle type, okay? A couple general uses of muscle. Number 1, muscle cells can have tone. Okay, when we're applying that to smooth muscle cells, for example, in our arteries, so these are little cells surrounding our arteries, okay? The tone that we have is what maintains our blood pressure. Okay, if all of our smooth muscle cells in our arteries relax at the same time, you're going to pass out, right? Because all of those blood vessels just got bigger. You got the same amount of fluid inside of them. So now all of a sudden we don't have enough pressure to get blood to our brain. And the best thing your body can do there is make it go horizontal, right? Because then it's not fighting gravity anymore, right? And so you pass out, okay? So we always have some level of contraction in those smooth muscle cells. Okay, and that's tone. That's what tone is. Okay, when it comes to skeletal muscle, same thing, right? Joint stability, but also, oh yeah, I think the next one's posture. Yeah, and also posture. Okay, so all of you are maintaining your posture right now. You're holding your head up, you're holding your back up, right? You're contracting a bunch of muscles that you're not even thinking about at all, right? They all have a certain level of contraction going on in them right now. That's muscle tone, right? Your brain learns how to do that at an early age, and then is constantly giving the right amount of contraction stimuli to your muscle just to keep you upright. Okay, if you've hung out with a little baby before, then you know what it looks like when the brain doesn't know how to do that yet, right? You try to sit them up and they just fall over, right? So the brain is slowly learning how to give the right amount of contraction to each of those muscles to keep your body in the right posture, and that's all muscle tone. Okay, obviously muscles helping us move. We think about that with skeletal muscle, but with smooth muscle in our arteries, this is obviously helping us move our blood around. Okay, so we have the general tone in our smooth muscle in our arteries, but then if we want to all of a sudden make the blood move faster, we squeeze down those arteries, right? We contract that smooth muscle more. And so now we've got the same amount of fluid in smaller pipes, but it's still moving. So it's going to move faster, right? That's what increasing our blood pressure does. Same idea. If we all of a sudden open up all those blood vessels a little bit, then everything can slow down, right? The blood pressure decreases, the movement of blood slows down a little bit. Okay. When it comes to our digestive tract, we got smooth muscle lining our digestive tract. Contraction happens in these wave-like patterns called peristalsis, which pushes food through our digestive tract and moves it along. Okay, and then obviously skeletal muscle is moving our joints, moving our body. Okay, questions or comments about any of this so far? Okay, so the histology here, the tissue of muscle is going to be predominantly cells, okay, which is more like what? We talked about connective tissue and epithelial tissue so far. What is that more like out of those two? Epithelial, right? Yeah. You guys are like, oh, that was last exam. I don't need to remember that. You do though, actually. But okay. Yeah, it's definitely more like epithelial tissue. Okay. So lots of cells, not much extracellular space. Okay. But then there's connective tissue kind of mixed around through it. It's not like totally separate like we typically have with epithelial tissue. It's kind of woven in throughout it. Okay. Cells start as myoblasts. Okay. Just like we talked about osteoblasts, chondroblasts. These are the cells that make the proteins and release them. Those are what make up our muscle tissue. Okay, and these are the 3 types. Okay, so we've got cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle. Okay, any questions on that so far? Good. Okay. All right. So smooth muscle cells. We'll look at some of the characteristics of these here. So they're non-striated, which means they don't have like stripes in them. Okay. That's why it's called smooth muscle, because it looks nice and smooth. Okay. They're spindle shaped. Those are spindles. Okay. That's why I put the little image of spindles there. Okay. It's just spindles of like a thread or yarn, right? Really, the idea there is it's kind of a bulging in the middle, and then it gets smaller on the two ends. Okay. And they only have one nucleus. Okay. These are controlled involuntarily, right? We can't think about our femoral artery and tell it to constrict, right? It's a good thing. We don't want to be thinking about all that stuff. It happens for us automatically. Okay. And so it's two primary places we find it: line in our blood vessels, line in our gastrointestinal tract. And this is what a microscopic image of it looks like. Okay, so that's smooth muscle. Okay, then we got cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is striated, meaning it's got lines in it. Okay, this image, you can kind of see some of those lines. Okay, looks just a little bit more like there's some stripes to it. Okay, two of the characteristics that are different from the smooth muscle is that it's cylindrical and the cells are branched. Okay, you can see that in one of these cells here, right? This is one cell here. You can see it has this branch here, this branch over here, another branch here, right? There's each branch is cylindrically shaped, but then it kind of reaches out in multiple directions. Okay, neither of the other two muscle cells look like that. Okay, it also just has one nucleus per cell. Okay, definitely involuntary. We can't control our heart rate on our own. Okay, obviously the main function is to pump blood, and by pumping blood, that's what really creates our blood pressure and maintains it. Smooth muscle of arteries is important for that too, but the origination of our blood pressure comes from the heart, right? That initial pump is what gives it the initial pressure. Okay, questions on either of these so far? Go ahead, Wesley.
This is like the blood vessels, or
Cardiac muscle is the heart itself.
okay, so it's the actual card.
Yeah, this is actually the cells of the ventricles of the atria. They're made up of cardiac muscle cells. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And so the blood vessels are lined with these smooth muscle cells.
Okay.
Right. So we have a layer of cells like this around our arteries, a little bit around our veins. Okay, but then when it comes to cardiac muscle, that's what makes up the ventricles of our heart and the atria of our heart. Good. Thanks for asking that question. Any other questions? Okay. Then the third type of muscle, skeletal muscle, right? This is the one we typically think of when we think of muscle. Okay. It is striated, meaning it has stripes. This image, you can kind of see that a little bit better on. Okay. The microscopic images on both of these, you can't see the striated feature that well, but really it just means striped, right? It has these kind of lines in it. Okay. They're also cylindrically shaped, but much, much longer than cardiac muscle cells. These cells have a bunch of nuclei. Okay, skeletal muscle cells, a single skeletal muscle cell can have a couple 100,000 nuclei in it. Okay, that's because imagine that one we were talking about in the sartorius that's 2 feet long, right? 2 or 3 feet long. If we need some protein down here by my knee, the nucleus way up here is not going to cut it, right? It's going to take way too long to get that protein down there. Okay, so we need to have nuclei all the way along so we can be constantly making all the components that our nucleus helps us make in all the different locations of the muscle, right? So this is really an issue of size. It's just too big to only have one nucleus. Okay, so need proteins made all along. So we need proteins made all along the muscle. Okay, these ones are voluntary, right? We can control them. We can think about it and contract it. Obviously, this is for movement, for posture. Okay, we kind of already talked about babies learning their posture, joint stability. A certain level of contraction is occurring in most of our muscles at all time. partially for posture, but then partially just to kind of keep our joints kind of stiff too, right? If our muscles go completely slack, then our joints get kind of loose too, right? And so we have a certain level of tone that keeps our joints stable. Another thing we don't think about much with skeletal muscle is heat generation, right? This is shivering, right? When you get really cold, one of your primary mechanisms and your body has to warm itself back up is just start contracting your muscle in a really inefficient way, right? Just it's really like 100% inefficient muscle contraction. All of the energy broken down there is lost as heat, and so it just warms you up. Okay, we can increase our heat production by 5-fold in just a few seconds, right? So skeletal muscle can burn a lot of energy really quick, and that warms us up. Okay, questions on any of that? Okay, well, I want you guys to work on this little recap here, talking about the 3 types. What does it look like? How do we control it? What are the primary functions? We'll come back together in a couple minutes. You will get marked down, but you have a chance to catch up for sure. You can miss like six or so classes over the semester and still get all the full points. So
So if I don't have my clicker, it's like missing a class.
yeah, but then you can have your click. You can not have your clicker, but like 6 classes and still get the full credit in that category. So
Okay.
you'll be okay.
Questions. You know, if like a lab, if we have lab the first week of class next semester.
Next semester. That's a good question. Yeah, I can look at it on my email right after class because we're starting to build that schedule right now. I just don't remember off the top of my head. But
Okay, because I know like this semester.
this year we did, yeah, which normally we'd never have actually, but it's because we went away from that whole Monday or Tuesday with a Monday schedule thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, just come up after class. I can pull it up. Yeah. Checking out that guy's search area. It's weird to actually see it. Yeah, no. Hey, go ahead and check with the people on your team. Make sure you're all on the same page with this information here.
That application for babies, it's just that their brain doesn't know.
Not-
Right, yeah.
Yeah, don't quite have the right muscle tone yet and right kind of feedback from their brain to contract the right muscles at in the right level of force to keep them up. Yeah.
I was like, I don't know what it looks like, but.
Yeah. How do you explain that? Yeah, for sure. All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. So as far as appearance goes, obviously the smooth part tells us something, and that's the non-striated, right? So we got non-striated on smooth muscle, non-striated, and then we go to striated on cardiac and skeletal. Okay, those are kind of part of the appearance. The other thing about smooth muscle is it's spindle shaped, right? We talked about that. And then with cardiac muscle, it's cylindrical and branched, right? Those are kind of 2 of the key features there. The branching is definitely a unique feature we don't see in any other type of muscle cell. Okay. And then with skeletal muscle, they're cylinders as well, but they're just massive. They're way, way bigger than the other ones. I'll show you an image of that in a sec on the slides, but much, much bigger, but also cylindrically shaped. Okay. Control, right? Smooth and cardiac, involuntary, right? Skeletal muscle, voluntary. Okay, and then functions, smooth muscle, what'd you guys put for function? Yeah, so pumping blood or maintaining blood pressure, not pumping blood, that would be the cardiac, but really maintaining blood pressure, right? And then, yeah, and then moving food, right? Is that what most of you said? And then with cardiac muscle, that's pumping blood, creating blood pressure. Okay, skeletal muscle, tone, posture, joint stability, movement, heat generation. I think those were the 5 that we had on there. Go ahead, Wesley. Yeah.
So for the GI tract, you know,
Yeah.
it's like it's moving down, you have to get the food moving down. Is that also contracting the clothes, or would that still be more cardiac muscles? Because I don't get the
Hmm.
difference between like smooth and cardiac, because I'm thinking of like blood vessels as they need to contract to kind of keep pushing stuff along.
Uh-huh.
Smooth would do that, or is
Yeah,
that
yeah,
cardiac?
with we'll get into it a lot more next semester with the digestive system, but along our digestive tract, we have 2 layers of muscle. If like this is the tube of our small intestine, we have one layer that's going this way, the longitudinal layer, and then another layer that's circular like this, right? That circular layer can constrict and completely block off a section if it wants to, okay? And then the other one, both layers are helping push things down in that peristalsis movement. But so that's kind of one thing. And then then we have sphincters inside of our digestive tract as well that can completely block off sections. So it is partially we're moving food down, but then a lot of times then it'll kind of clinch down there. So it hits up against that and to kind of churn the food up. So it's a mix of moving and also stopping and separating sections.
Okay.
But maybe, did I answer all of your question or not quite?
Somewhat like with the smooth, is that line, so it's lining the blood, so like veins and stuff would be like it's around the veins.
Yep, veins,
Just pretty much
arteries.
Not letting it burst, because like with the pumping.
No, oh, good. So you're asking the real purpose of that
Yeah.
smooth muscle around
Yeah.
blood vessels
Yeah,
is to change the size of blood vessels.
okay.
That's
geez,
what it
that's
is. Yep.
that's
So it's called vasoconstriction, which would be shrinking down those blood vessels, or vasodilation would be opening up those blood vessels. And so when we open them up, that will decrease our blood pressure typically. When we constrict them, that'll increase our blood pressure. Good question. Other questions on any of this? Okay. All right. So let's dive a little deeper into skeletal muscle cells here. Okay, this is one of 2 cells in the body that are known as fibers. We also call neurons fibers as well. It's just because they're long and tough. Okay, extremely large cells, right? They're very long, right? We talked about this one already, 2 or 3 feet in the sartorius. I just have this image of this guy because it's not very often that you can see somebody's sartorius, but you can see his pretty clearly there. You also see some veins on top of it too, right? That's because bodybuilders severely dehydrate themselves before competitions to get their skin to just suck down to their bodies, but also obviously lifts a lot of weights too. But yeah, that's the big sartorius there. So very long, but also very thick too. Muscle cells, skeletal muscle cells are about at least 10 times the thickness of a typical cell in the body. Okay, so much, just a very different structure than a typical cell. Okay, they're surrounded by a membrane called the endomysium. Okay, this is a version of that areolar connective tissue that we talked about previously. Okay. The next, give you one more sec to finish writing that down. Any questions? Okay, so this is just showing the difference between like what we consider a typical cell, which is a red blood cell, and an average size skeletal muscle cell, right? Just a completely different thing, right? Just so much more massive, very, very large, very thick, very long, both those things, okay? This is just kind of some calculations I did one time, just for fun to kind of see how many nuclei actually are in a typical muscle cell. It's about 40 to 70 nuclei per millimeter of size, okay? Again, this is just for fun. You're not going to have to like reproduce these calculations, but yeah, if we take that 2-foot long muscle cell in the sartorius, that's about 600 millimeters. Take that's around 33,000 nuclei in a single muscle cell from the sartorius, right? So just a totally different cell, right? We don't have many cells that look, we don't have any cells that look anything like these skeletal muscle cells. They're big, they're long, and they have many, many nuclei, way more than any other cell in the body. I like how no matter how many times I tell you guys you're not going to have to reproduce it, you got to write it down though. It's gonna end up on your paper one way or the other. Okay, that's what I'm letting you giving you some more time to finish writing it down. Because you'll be upset if I go fast. Okay, we good? Yeah, Riley, got a question? Like divide? Yeah, it's not very often. Yeah, so skeletal muscle cells don't divide like regular cells do. Yeah, we have stem cells within our skeletal muscle cell area that kind of create the new muscle cells. But this is kind of a big debate in exercise physiology and in strength training research, is like, how do muscles get bigger? Is it because each cell gets bigger, or is it because we get more cells, right? And that's kind of known as like the hypertrophy versus hyperplasia debate. Hypertrophy means cells getting bigger, hyperplasia means getting more cells. And so in general, it looks like it's mostly hypertrophy, like the cells themselves just grow and they add nuclei and they add more proteins to them. But there is some evidence that maybe skeletal muscle cells can be added, but it's not a typical division of the cell to add more. We have these cells called satellite cells that come in and add themselves to an existing cell, or a bunch of these satellite cells come together and make a new cell. That's kind of the way it typically works. They're just too large to divide, right? It doesn't really make sense for them to divide. So that's a great question. Yeah, Wesley?
I know that like the muscles like get small tears and then they kind of grow back. Is it like self-healing in the way that skin self-heals? Is it like that? So it also has that ability?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because like, if we damage a big muscle cell like that, that's a foot long, right? Like it would be a lot of work and a lot of resources to just make a whole new cell, right? So pretty much, yeah, part of that membrane might have ruptured, right? So there's a section of that cell that's not doing so well, but yeah, it definitely heals up. That's where we get satellite cells coming in and actually kind of fixing that area, adding the nucleus to the cell. And so, yeah, very good at healing for sure. Yeah, great question. Other questions so far? Okay, all right, so let's talk about some of the special characteristics of skeletal muscle here. So the skeletal muscle membrane is called the sarcolemma, right? This is just our phospholipid bilayer like we have in all cells, but it's a unique one in skeletal muscle cells. Okay, it's unique for one reason, is because it has this special structure called the motor end plate. Okay, so we can see that here. It's where our neurons interact with the skeletal muscle cells. So it's kind of dented in and then it's highly folded. Okay, and in that area we have receptors for the neurotransmitter that neurons release to activate our muscle cells, and it's called acetylcholine. Okay, acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter for skeletal muscle, to activate it, to make it contract. Okay, so we got special receptors there, all spotted along this folded area, because this nerve is going to release acetylcholine and have that bind to the muscle cell. Okay. Yeah, and it's obviously very, very folded. Okay, so there's a neuron coming in from the nervous system. We can see it kind of zoomed out here, and then we're just zooming in on this one spot where that neuron interacts with it, and that's right here. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. All right, so a little bit about the anatomy of skeletal muscle cells. We have a special structure in the membrane called T-tubules, or transverse tubules. Okay, these are cylindrical indentations of the cell membrane. Okay, pretty much you're going along the cell membrane, and then there's this little spot that pokes in, goes deep in the cell, and that's the transverse tubules. Okay, what this does is it allows the things called action potentials, which we're going to get into those a lot when we get into the nervous system, but pretty much that is like a nerve signal. When you think about signals passing around in your brain and through your body, those are action potentials. They're stimuli, electrical stimuli that go down neurons and go down muscle cells. Okay, so what that T-tubule allows for is for that nerve signal not just to stay on the top, right? Because if we've got this big old muscle cell like this, if the nerve signal is just stuck up there on the top, it would never really interact with the deeper parts of the cell. So those T-tubules allow that nerve signal to dive deep into the cell and interact with the structures on the inside. And we'll talk about why it needs to do that next time. Okay, so that's the T-tubules. We also have something called sarcoplasmic reticulum inside of skeletal muscle cells. This is a specialized version of the endoplasmic reticulum. Right, we have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum and the rough endoplasmic reticulum in cells. This is a specialized version of that with the primary purpose to store and release calcium. Okay, calcium is the primary ion that's going to allow us to cause muscle contraction, and so we store a bunch of it inside there. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum interacts directly with these T-tubules because it's that nerve signal that's going to cause the calcium release to allow for muscle contraction. Okay, and then this whole idea that muscle cells are multinucleated. Okay, we've pretty much already talked about that. And this was answering the question that Riley asked as well. Muscle cells don't divide much because of this, right? It just makes it kind of impossible for them to divide. Okay, so this next image, I want you to label those structures we just talked about, and then on your clickers, send in the answer to that question. Go ahead, work on that with your team.
Die
Yeah,
or whatever.
yeah.
Like, those cells like fuse back together, or
For the most part, yeah. For the most part, yeah. Yeah, they can fuse back together. Yeah, I mean, there can be permanent damage in certain instances, but if you give it the right stuff it needs, like, you know, if you keep using it and like keeping it stretched, then they might not be able to come back together. But if you can, if you can kind of splint it to where the muscles are actually touching, the cells are actually touching, then it'll fuse back together. Yeah. Yeah. It's very regenerative tissue for sure. Yeah.
I definitely think I'm not answering the question.
Okay.
Is
Yeah.
it on your website?
It's on Canvas, right at the very top module of Canvas. One of the links there just says office hours.
Okay,
So,
awesome.
yeah, for sure. Yep.
Oh, look.
All right. So you're sending in the answer to that question there on the bottom.
Yeah. I don't think that's fair definition.
All right. About 5 more of you, I think, need to send that in. All right. I think we're almost there. So we're between B and C. Okay. B and C. Why don't you guys turn to the people on your team and try to convince each other of your answer, and you can change it if you want. Change the one that you sent in. I haven't closed it yet.
I think that's what how we do the overall mitochondria. Also, with the no, in every volume
Yeah, that's gonna be the same.
Anyway, ninth grade biology class. I might try to go to five.
No, like in those, I don't know why. I don't think it's whatever reason.
That would be sick.
I really want to look it up.
Yeah, I don't think they really have a color at all.
What?
I don't think they really have a color at all. Yeah. But they do typically show them as purple. Yeah, they do. Yeah. All right. We're kind of settling in on B a little bit. 2/3 of you are saying B now, 1/3 saying C. Okay. So what is it about B? There's something pretty specific about B that is described right here. Interacts with the T tubules, right? There we go. Okay. We can see those yellow T tubules interacting directly with this structure here. So yes, B is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Then what's C? Mitochondria. Yeah, skeletal muscle cells have a lot of mitochondria, okay, because they're making a lot of energy. Okay. So one of the most dense cells as far as mitochondria go. Okay. All right. So what's A? The nucleus, yeah. B, we already said was the sarcoplasmic reticulum. C, we said was mitochondria. What about D? D is just the membrane, right? That's the sarcolemma. But then E is the T tubules, right? You can kind of see the point at which it starts on the membrane, but then you can see how it dives way down deep. All right, so we're going to have sarcoplasmic reticulums around each of these bundles, right? There's lots and lots of those sarcoplasmic reticulums. So it's those T tubules are interacting with all of them as they dive deep into the cell. And this is a gross underestimation of how many of those bundles we would have, right? Because we're talking about everything on the very, very small microscopic level. So you'd have way, way more than those. Okay, questions on any of those? Okay. So this is kind of taking us back to the notes from Friday that you watched, where we looked at this hierarchy of skeletal muscle. Okay. So why don't you just do this, fill this in here, and then answer this question on the clickers, just to make sure we're all on the same page before we move on and talk about a little bit more depth on one of those structures. Okay, so what do we call each of those little structures? Not the membranes at this point, but you did learn that on the Friday one. So if you go back to that one that says skeletal muscle hierarchy on the notes from Friday, you should see something just like this. Maybe some of you haven't watched that video yet. Uh-oh. The video from Friday's class.
Well, that's the one we want.
Okay, sure. You're right.
Then because this, then like B is the fascicle, and C is the myocyte, and then this is the
All right, so you're sending in the one that is the actual muscle cell itself or muscle fiber. You can call it either one. Maybe if you haven't watched the video yet, somebody on your team has, and they can help you out. Okay, give you about 10 more seconds. Okay, there's still about 5 more of you that need to send it in, it looks like. I'll leave it open for a sec, but let's start working through this. So what do we call A? Just the muscle, right? So that would be like the biceps brachii or the tensor fascia lata, whatever muscle it is we're talking about. That muscle is made up of a bunch of these big bundles here in B. What do we call that? Fascicle. Good. Okay. And then those fascicles are made up of a bunch of what? Cells, right? That's the muscle cells, muscle fibers. Okay. And then those muscle cells are just a big bundle of the one there in D. What do we call that one? Not quite. Myofibril, right? Yeah. So we're going myofibril first. Okay. And then each myofibril is made up of a bunch of these ones in E here, which is called the sarcomere. Okay. So that's just kind of the hierarchy of breaking down these little components. Okay. So the actual muscle cell there again was C, which is what 75% of you put. So good job. Okay, so that's just kind of showing us where we're at because we're going to dive in deeper into the sarcomere here and look at those different proteins that make up the sarcomere. Okay, questions on any of that? Okay, so the sarcomere is considered the functional unit of muscle. Okay, there's a structure here called the Z disc. Okay, so from one Z disc to the next Z disc, that's a single sarcomere. Okay, it's made up of myofilaments, okay, which are proteins. Okay, those Z discs are really the part of the lines that make muscle look striated. Okay, we can see a microscopic image there. There's an M line, there's a Z disc. Both of those things are kind of part of the lines that give it that striated look. Okay, so we're going to look at all those proteins and we'll finish up with that. Okay, so myofilaments are just another name for proteins inside a muscle. Okay, we've got 5 main ones here that we'll kind of get to look at. Okay, number one's called myosin. This is also known as the thick filament. Okay, it's much thicker. It has these heads that stick out that actually will grab onto the one below it, the actin, and move them. Okay, so, and then we have actin, which is known as the thin filament. It's a bunch of little globular proteins strung together. This is the one that actually slides. On Monday's class, we're going to talk about what's called the sliding filament theory, which is how muscle cells shorten. And so the one that actually slides is actin, but it's the myosin heads that grab onto actin and make them slide. Okay. Troponin is another important one. This is the one that has the calcium binding site to it that makes that sarcoplasmic reticulum so important to hold on to that calcium so we can release it and send that calcium in. Tropomyosin is another one that kind of strings along the actin and blocks the binding site for the myosin head. Okay, also gives some strength to actin. And then finally, titin is this is really what makes up the elastic component of muscle. It's a spring-shaped protein that we can stretch it out and then it bounces back really forcefully. This is the largest protein in the body. It's about 30,000 amino acids long. Okay, so go ahead and label those structures there, those proteins we were just talking about. And then on your clickers, send in the one that you think is myosin.
Yeah. Yeah. To be tight. And then it's like E right now.
And B is, the director.
All right, give you about 15 more seconds, about 10 or so more of you need to send that in. Sending in the one that's myosin. All right, still about 4 more of you. Make sure to send it in, hit the send button just in case. Okay, we can start walking through. I'll leave it open if you still need to send that in. Okay, so what do you think A is? Yeah, this one's troponin. That's the one that has a calcium binding site on it. And so calcium is going to bind to it and totally change its shape. We'll talk more about that next time. But then you can see troponin is directly connected to the one that's also labeled there as B. What do you think B is? Yeah, that one's tropomyosin. Okay, and so when troponin changes shape because calcium binds to it, since it's touching tropomyosin, it moves that whole blue band of tropomyosin and then opens up this binding site there, right? That's just taking one of those little actin globules and pulling it out so you can see it. And so tropomyosin's in the way of that little concave part, right? But that's where the myosin head is going to bind to it. Okay. So then C, what's C? Myosin. And then D. Yeah, this one's tightened. It's that spring-shaped one. Okay, we can see it here and here and here. It's kind of helping just to hold everything together. Okay. And then lastly, E is what? Actin. There we go. Okay, so next class we'll dive in deep into how all those things work and what they are. Hold on one sec. Just real quick, all of our textbooks are in 2D, right? And so it always looks like myosin in the middle, actin, actin. But that's not really how it is, right? It's 3D. So we have around 6 of those actin fibers around myosin in general, and that's kind of more what it looks like. All right, guys, have a wonderful break, and we'll see you on Monday. Bye.
Are we gonna read the nap?